The rain didn't just fall, it lashed against the concrete steps of the downtown courthouse like nature itself was trying to issue a warning. Something is going to break today, and it won't just be the sky. A woman in a pale trench coat took the steps one by one. She moved slowly, her hand resting protectively over the swell of her pregnant belly. Her face was the color of chalk, drained of warmth, but her eyes were something else entirely. Calm, unshatterable. The moment she pushed through the heavy oak doors, the courthouse lobby went dead silent. Every eye locked onto her. It was Victoria Sterling, the wife of billionaire Andrew Sterling. The whispers caught fire, spreading faster than a dry wind. She actually showed up. Victoria walked through the noise like it was nothing but static. She kept her chin high, moving straight toward the courtroom where her husband was already waiting. Andrew Sterling sat at the defendant's table. He was one of the wealthiest corporate titans in the country, tall, tailored to the millimeter, wearing a face cut from ice. Next to him sat his shiny new distraction, Chloe. A striking brunette poured into a designer dress, wearing a smile that had victory written all over it. Andrew placed his hand over hers, a public exhibit of his choice. When Victoria crossed the threshold, the air in the room just vanished. For a fraction of a second, Andrew froze. He hadn't seen his wife in almost 5 months, yet when his eyes finally swept over her face, they were terrifyingly blank. He looked at her the way you look at a stranger holding up the line at a coffee shop. "You actually decided to show up," he said, his voice flat. Victoria pulled out the heavy wooden chair across from him and sat. "This is about my child. Of course I showed up." Chloe let out a soft, breathy laugh. She leaned in, thinking she had the upper hand. "Look, excuse me," Chloe purred, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You know perfectly well that Andrew loves me. A baby isn't a bargaining chip to keep a man." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. But Andrew didn't correct her. Instead, his fingers tightened around Chloe's hand. "She's right," Andrew said, his tone casual, almost bored. "Our marriage has been dead for a long time." Those words hit Victoria harder than a closed fist. This was the same man who once swore under a bruised velvet sky that he would love her until his lungs gave out. The same man who used to sit awake by her bedside, holding a damp cloth to her forehead when she was sick. The man who once looked at her and whispered, "If I owned the entire world but didn't have you, I'd still be a beggar." Now he was looking at her like she was a typo in one of his contracts. The judge brought the gavel down. The docket seemed straightforward enough. A messy divorce, a brutal division of assets, a custody battle over an unborn kid. But nobody in that room had the slightest clue that they were sitting on a powder keg. Andrew's high-priced attorney stood up first, smoothing his silk tie. "My client is requesting an immediate dissolution of the marriage. Furthermore, given Mrs. Sterling's documented emotional instability, we believe it is imperative to restrict her parental rights regarding the unborn child." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Victoria slowly lifted her gaze. "What?" Andrew didn't even bother to look in her direction. "It's what's best for the child," he stated. "Best?" Her voice finally caught a tiny crack in the armor. "You want to take my son away from me." Andrew sighed, the picture of weary reason. "I want to give him the future he deserves." "And I'm not worthy of doing that?" she asked. Andrew leaned forward, his eyes cold and empty. "You're alone. You have no money, no support system, no home." He delivered each word like he was reading a quarterly earnings report. Victoria felt something twist violently in her gut. 5 months ago, it was Andrew who had locked her out of their sprawling estate. 5 months ago, he had moved Chloe into her house, into her bed. 5 months ago, he had looked her dead in the eye and said, "I just don't need you anymore." And she had walked away. She didn't scream. She didn't throw glass. She didn't beg for a dime. She simply vanished into the fog of the city. For 5 long months, Andrew walked around with the absolute certainty that he had broken her. But he was wrong. He was so incredibly, fatally wrong. The judge peered down from the bench, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Sterling, do you have a response?" Victoria stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Her hands were shaking just a fraction of an inch, but her eyes were like deep, still water. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. And right then, for the very first time that morning, a crease appeared on Andrew's forehead. Because stamped right on the center of that folder was a logo he knew intimately. The seal of his own company, his empire. Andrew jerked forward in his seat, the boredom instantly evaporating. "Where did you get that?" Victoria looked him dead in the eye. For the first time since she walked into the room, the ghost of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. "That's a very interesting question, Andrew." Chloe frowned, her manicured nails digging into her purse. "What does that mean?" she hissed. Victoria slowly flipped the folder open. Inside was a stack of papers, corporate contracts, offshore bank statements, signed non-disclosure agreements. And right at the bottom lay one specific document. A document Andrew had spent the last decade believing was buried forever. The moment his eyes locked onto the first page, all the blood drained from Andrew's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "No," he breathed. "Yes, Andrew," Victoria said, sliding the heavy parchment across the polished wood toward the judge. "This is the original copy of your father's will." The courtroom sucked in a breath of air all at once. Chloe blinked in confusion, tugging at Andrew's sleeve. What is she talking about?" But Andrew was deaf to her. His knuckles were bone white. He was already spiraling back to a day 10 years ago. A decade ago, right after his father's funeral, the corporate lawyers had gathered in a mahogany boardroom and announced a tragedy. The final will had vanished. Because of that convenient disappearance, the entire multi-billion-dollar conglomerate had defaulted to Andrew. No disputes, no conditions, no strings attached. But now, if Victoria was actually holding the original document, it meant the nightmare scenario was real. Everything he thought he owned, every penthouse, every subsidiary, every offshore account might not belong to him at all. Victoria stood there watching the sheer devastation wash over her husband's face. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt the heavy, rusted wheels of justice finally start to turn. But Andrew didn't even know the worst of it yet. He had no idea what name was printed on the very last line of that parchment. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the rain drumming against the frosted glass windows. The judge carefully picked up the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. Andrew leaped to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "It's a forgery!" "Take a seat, Mr. Sterling," the judge barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "I'm telling you it's impossible. The original was destroyed years ago." Victoria just watched him unravel. This was what it looked like when a man who had played God for 10 years suddenly realized he was out of miracles. Chloe nervously grabbed his wrist. "Andrew, tell me what's going on." He ripped his arm away as if she had burned him. "Shut up!" She recoiled, staring at him in shock. In all their months of luxury and whispered promises, he had never once spoken to her like that. The judge kept reading. You could see the weather changing on his face. First, mild confusion, then profound shock, and finally a deep, gripping fascination. He pulled his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose and peered at Andrew. "Mr. Sterling, according to this document, your father did not leave the family conglomerate to a single heir." "That is a lie!" Andrew shouted. "It states right here," the judge continued, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, "that the controlling stake of the company was to be divided between you and your legal spouse immediately upon the birth of your first child." The gallery erupted into a frantic buzz. Chloe spun around to face Andrew. "Why are you so pale?" Chloe demanded. "That can't be real." But Andrew's mind was already dragging him back. 10 years ago, the final conversation with his old man. He could still smell the sharp chemical stench of the hospital room. The old man was lying in that sterile bed looking up at his son with eyes full of overwhelming sorrow. "Andrew," his father had rasped, "wealth hollows a man out. It's already hollowing you. The only thing of true value in this world is family. I've structured my will so that you will never, ever forget that." The old man had tried to hand him a folder that night. Andrew hadn't even bothered to open it. He figured it was just another one of the old man's self-righteous lectures. The next morning, his father flatlined. A week later, the documents vanished. Andrew had torn the estate apart looking for them. The lawyers hired private investigators. Nothing. Over the years, he convinced himself the will was just a myth, a ghost story. But here it was, sitting in a humid courtroom, the real deal, complete with the wax seals, the notary stamps, and the unmistakable, jagged handwriting of his dead father. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice reduced to a hoarse scrape. Victoria let the silence stretch out, letting him suffocate in it just a little longer. Finally, she answered, "It was kept safe by a man who loved your father more than he loved the money." Andrew furrowed his brow, his mind racing, and then a name hit him like a freight train. "Arthur." Victoria gave a slow, deliberate nod. Arthur Vance, the old estate manager. A man who had worked for the Sterling family since Andrew's grandfather was running the show. 3 months ago, Victoria had stumbled across the old man in a sleepy coastal town up north. She was a wreck back then. Pregnant, isolated, her bank accounts frozen. Arthur had invited her in for a cup of black tea. He sat across from her, studying her face for a long time before he finally spoke. "You have the exact same fire in your eyes that Andrew's mother had," the old man had said softly. He let out a ragged sigh. "And Andrew is making the exact same mistakes his grandfather made." At the time, Victoria didn't have a clue what he was talking about. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur walked over to a heavy iron safe hidden behind a bookshelf. He spun the dial, pulled out a dusty manila folder, and set it on the table. "I made a promise to your father-in-law," Arthur had told her. "I promised to keep this buried until the day his son forgot what it meant to be a human being." Victoria had stared at the papers, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you bring this to light years ago?" she asked. The old man offered a sad, tired smile. "Because for a long time, Andrew truly loved you. He loved me," she had asked, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Yes," Arthur insisted. He was certain of it. But then the ego took over. The greed, the other women. He started losing his soul piece by piece. Arthur pushed the folder across the table. "Now it's in your hands. You decide what happens next." And today the bill had finally come due. Andrew sank heavily back into his chair. He stared at Victoria like he was seeing her for the very first time. While he had been out popping champagne with Chloe, while he had been mapping out his new bachelor life, while he was busy humiliating the woman carrying his child, she had been working. She had been quietly gathering the pieces, surviving the storm, and forging herself into a weapon. Chloe shot up from her seat, her chair teetering backward. "Andrew, you need to explain this to me right now." He didn't say a word. "You told me you owned everything," she shrieked. Still silence. "You promised we were getting married." Andrew slowly lifted his eyes to look at her. The arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. "I thought we were," he muttered. "I thought I did." Chloe was practically hyperventilating, her face flushed with fury. "Do you even understand what this means?" She snatched a glance at the papers on the judge's bench, her expression twisting into a mask of horror. Because the judge had just reached the final page, and he was reading the ultimate clause out loud for the record. According to the last will and testament of Michael Sterling, upon the birth of the first heir, 70% of the total assets of Sterling Enterprises shall be transferred into a blind trust managed exclusively by the child's mother until said child reaches the age of majority. The courtroom went dead. 70%. Not to Andrew, not to the board of directors, to the mother. to Victoria. All the color drained from Chloe's perfectly contoured face. "No," she whimpered. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, in the event of documented infidelity against the legal spouse, the heir apparent is immediately suspended from all executive duties pending a full review by the Board of Shareholders. Andrew bolted upright. What? But Victoria already knew that clause by heart. That clause was the exact reason she had walked into this building today. She wasn't here for petty revenge. She wasn't here for a payout. She was here to build an impenetrable fortress around her unborn son. Without breaking eye contact with her husband, Victoria calmly pulled her smartphone from her pocket, opened her email app, and turned the screen toward the judge. "Your Honor, I received an additional piece of correspondence at 6 a.m. this morning." The judge leaned over, squinted at the glowing screen, and raised his eyebrows. "This appears to be an official notice of termination from the Board of Directors." Victoria nodded. Andrew felt the polished wooden floor drop out from under his expensive Italian shoes. "No, this can't be happening." And then the horrifying reality locked into place. They already knew. The board had been briefed on the will before he even walked into the courtroom. If that email was real, it meant that at any second those heavy oak doors were going to swing open, and the people Andrew had always considered his loyal attack dogs, the people who just yesterday were calling him a visionary, were about to publicly slaughter him. Right on cue, the massive brass handles of the courtroom doors turned, and they slowly pushed open. Every head in the gallery whipped around. 5 men and 1 woman marched down the center aisle. Impeccable tailored suits, faces carved from granite. Their sudden appearance was the final nail in Andrew's coffin. He knew every single one of them. These were the apex predators of the Sterling Enterprises board, the inner circle that helped him rule a global empire. Leading the pack was a silver-haired shark with dead eyes. Richard Thorne, the chairman of the board. He came to a halt right behind Andrew's table. "We're sorry it had to play out like this in a public forum," Richard said, his voice smooth as glass. Andrew let out a frantic, bitter laugh. "Are you seriously pulling this stunt in the middle of my divorce hearing?" "You pulled the stunt, Andrew," Richard countered, pulling a sleek tablet from his briefcase. "As of 8 a.m. today, independent forensic experts verified the authenticity of your father's will." Andrew shook his head violently. "No, you don't have the authority to make a move without my vote." "We already did." Those 3 words dropped like a guillotine. Something fundamental broke inside Andrew's chest. Richard didn't miss a beat. "In accordance with the corporate bylaws and the founder's final mandate, you are officially suspended from all operations within the holding company pending a federal audit." "That is illegal!" Andrew roared. "It's ironclad," Richard shot back, finally raising his voice. "I built half of this damn company," Andrew screamed. "No, Andrew," Richard said, staring him down. "You inherited it." A suffocating silence swallowed the room once more. Everyone sitting in those wooden pews understood what they were watching. This wasn't a messy divorce anymore. This was a public execution. The utter destruction of a man who believed he was untouchable. Andrew slowly turned his head to look at Victoria. She was just sitting there. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She just looked at him with a quiet, devastating pity. And that drove him absolutely insane. "You orchestrated all of this, didn't you?" he spat. She slowly shook her head. "No." "You're lying." "I didn't plan anything, Andrew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the room. "I just stopped covering for you." Those words cut deeper than any legal document ever could. Because in a flash of agonizing clarity, Andrew remembered. He remembered the countless times she had defended him to his friends, to his family, to the press. She had always found a way to justify his cruelty, his emotional absence, his obsession with the grind. She had loved him exactly as he was, and he had taken a sledgehammer to that love with a smile on his face. Suddenly, Chloe leaped up, grabbing his arm. "Andrew, say something! Do something!" He just stared at the floor. She dug her nails into his expensive wool sleeve. "You promised me everything was under control." "Get off me," he muttered. "What did you just say?" "I said get off me." He violently shoved her hand away, and right then, the terrifying truth dawned on Chloe. The man she had wrecked a family for was losing his crown, and her first-class ticket to a life of luxury was going down in flames with him. Her face went ashen. "You told me you loved me," she whispered. Andrew closed his eyes. Love. For the first time in God knows how long, he actually interrogated that word. Did he ever truly love Chloe? Or did he just love the narcotic high of having a beautiful young woman look at him like he was a god? Did he care about her laugh, her mind, her soul? The answer hit him like a physical blow. He didn't know a damn thing about her. He had fallen in love with the feeling of winning, the illusion of eternal youth, the raw adrenaline of absolute power. But love, real love, that was never in the room with them. He opened his eyes and looked back at Victoria, and his chest seized up in agony. He remembered the first time he saw her. He was 23, the dusty campus library. She was sitting by a frosted window buried in a paperback. He walked over with a stupid pickup line, just wanting to get her number. He ended up sitting in that chair for 3 hours, forgetting that the rest of the universe existed. He remembered their first cramped apartment, eating cheap ramen noodles out of styrofoam cups, laughing until their ribs ached when the bathroom ceiling started leaking. He had absolutely nothing to his name back then, but he was profoundly, undeniably happy. When did it change? When did the zeros in the bank account become his religion? When did he start looking at loyalty as a liability? A crushing weight settled on his lungs. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't terrified of losing the money or the company. He was terrified because he realized he had already lost the only thing that gave his life any meaning. He stared at Victoria, his soul completely bare. She caught his look and she understood it instantly. But it was too late. He was finally seeing her, truly seeing her, but the bridge was already burned to ash. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for a recess. The gallery exploded into motion. Reporters practically tripped over themselves, rushing toward the board members. But Andrew remained glued to his chair, paralyzed like a man waking up from a coma. Victoria stood up, placed a protective hand on her belly, and started walking toward the heavy doors. Suddenly, a voice cracked through the noise. "Wait!" She stopped, her hand resting on the brass handle, but she didn't turn around. She heard his footsteps behind her. Slow, hesitant. There was a time when Andrew Sterling walked into a room like he owned the oxygen in it. Now he approached her like a man terrified of the sound of his own breathing. Victoria. She kept her back to him, wrapped in silence. "Please, just look at me." The seconds dragged on. Finally, she turned her head, and she physically flinched, because for the first time in their entire history, Andrew was crying. Real, ragged, uncalculated tears. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I made a mistake." She didn't blink. "The worst mistake of my entire life." Her expression remained perfectly stoic, but beneath the surface, her nerves were screaming. Because years ago, she would have traded her soul to hear him say those exact words. She had waited for them, prayed for them, cried herself to sleep, hoping he would wake up. But now the words were just empty sound. "I was a fool," Andrew whispered, his voice breaking. "I lost you." Victoria looked at him for a long, agonizing moment before speaking. "No." He looked up, his red eyes full of confusion. "You lost yourself, Andrew." The truth of that statement hit him so hard he stopped breathing. She was right. He looked back at the man he had been for the last 5 years and didn't recognize the reflection. The casual cruelty, the suffocating arrogance, the endless betrayals, the bottomless greed. Who the hell had he become, and what was the prize? Victoria turned back toward the door. "I have to go." "Please," he begged, taking a desperate step forward. She froze again. He was close enough now to see the dark circles under her eyes, to see how much weight she had lost, to see how delicately she cradled their unborn child. And then his eyes dropped to her left hand. The gold wedding band was gone, a tiny, insignificant piece of metal, but its absence shattered him completely. In that split second, Andrew realized his deepest, darkest delusion all these months. He secretly believed she would just wait in the wings. He thought that whenever he got bored and snapped his fingers, she would fold and forgive him. But the woman standing in front of him wasn't his safety net anymore. She was forged steel, independent, untouchable, and completely devoid of love for him. Right at that exact moment, a sharp ringtone pierced the air. Victoria reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She glanced at the screen and the color instantly drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. "What is it?" Andrew asked, his parental instincts suddenly flaring. She slowly looked up at him, and for the first time today, he saw genuine, naked terror in her eyes. "It's the hospital," she whispered, her voice trembling. She pressed the phone to her ear. Judging by the erratic rhythm of her breathing, the news on the other end was catastrophic. "What happened?" Andrew demanded, taking a step toward her. She didn't answer him. She just kept listening to the doctor, her face growing paler with every passing second. "I'm on my way right now," she choked out. She lowered the phone, her hand shaking so violently she almost dropped it. Andrew felt a cold dread pool in his stomach. "Victoria, tell me." She looked at him completely lost. "It's Arthur. She swallowed hard. "He had a massive heart attack." For a second, Andrew's brain short-circuited. Arthur Vance, the man who had basically raised him, the man he used to call his second father, the man he had ruthlessly fired and exiled from the company simply because the old man had the nerve to look him in the eye and say, "You're turning into the exact monster your father warned you about." Andrew had been so blinded by rage that day. He had accused Arthur of treason, stripped him of his pension, and never called him again. And now the old man was lying in a trauma bay, hovering between life and death. "I'm driving you," Andrew said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No, Andrew, I can manage." She took one step toward the exit and abruptly froze. She gasped, grabbing her stomach with both hands. Her face twisted into a mask of pure agony. Andrew's heart stopped. "What's wrong?" "I'm fine," she gritted out. But she wasn't. A second wave of pain hit her so hard her knees buckled. Her leather tote slipped from her fingers, scattering legal documents across the marble floor. She let out a sharp, breathless cry, and that's when Andrew saw it. A dark, terrifying stain was slowly spreading down the fabric of her pale coat. Blood. The entire world just stopped spinning. The courtroom, the lawyers, the money, the betrayal, it all vanished into thin air. "No!" he screamed, lunging forward. "Victoria!" She was swaying, barely conscious. Her lips were completely white. "Andrew," she whispered. For the first time in years, she sounded like a terrified little girl. Another brutal contraction ripped through her abdomen. She screamed and collapsed. Andrew caught her just before she hit the marble floor. "Somebody get a doctor!" He roared, his voice tearing out of his throat, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Call an ambulance, now!" Chaos erupted. People rushed out of the courtroom. The judge sprinted out of his chambers. Security guards were screaming into their radios. Andrew was on his knees on the cold floor, pulling Victoria against his chest. His hands were slick with her blood. He stared down at her pale face, feeling his mind shatter into a million pieces. "Please, God, no. Not this." Victoria was gasping for air, clutching his shirt. "Our baby! Our son!" "He's going to be fine. You're going to be fine," Andrew choked out, but he didn't believe a word he was saying. She saw the absolute terror in his eyes, and for the first time that day, she reached up and gripped his hand. Her grip was weak, fading fast. "Don't let him die," she whispered. Those 4 words broke him completely. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. He didn't care about the board of directors. He didn't care about the stocks, the offshore accounts, the legacy. If he lost her and the boy today, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not survive it. The wail of the ambulance sirens pierced the air a few minutes later, but to Andrew, it felt like he had been kneeling on that floor for a decade. The paramedics swarmed in, lifting her onto a gurney. "How far along?" a medic shouted over the noise. 32 weeks, she groaned through the pain. The paramedic's face went grim. "We're looking at a severe premature abruption." Andrew felt the ground open up and swallow him whole. "Is she going to make it?" The medic locked eyes with him. "It's critical, for both the mother and the baby." That was the kill shot. Andrew practically threw himself into the back of the ambulance. Nobody tried to stop him, not even Victoria. She was fading into unconsciousness. The ride to the ER was a blur of flashing lights and screaming sirens. Andrew held her blood-stained hand the entire time, his mind torturing him with memories. He remembered the night she told him she was pregnant. She had cooked a huge dinner, nervous and jittery, before finally sliding a tiny pair of knit socks across the kitchen table. He had laughed a deep, booming laugh of pure joy. He had scooped her up, spun her around the kitchen, and yelled at the top of his lungs, "We're having a baby!" He had promised to build a fortress around them. He had promised to be the father he never had. And then he had burned his own house down because of his ego, because of cheap thrills, because of a woman whose last name he could barely remember right now. Chloe. Where was she? Probably still standing in the courthouse lobby throwing a tantrum about her canceled credit cards. He didn't give a damn. Because the brutal truth had finally landed, the mistress was just background noise. Victoria was the whole movie. And if she died on that operating table, he would never, ever forgive himself. The ambulance slammed to a halt at the emergency bay. The doors flew open, and a trauma team rushed Victoria through the swinging doors of the surgical wing. Andrew tried to sprint after them, but a burly nurse shoved him back. "You can't go in there." "I'm her husband," he screamed. "Wait in the hall!" The heavy doors clicked shut, locking him out. He was completely alone in the sterile fluorescent hallway. For the first time since he was a kid, he had no leverage. He couldn't write a check to fix this. He couldn't fire death. He slid down the cold, tiled wall, buried his face in his bloody hands, and wept. He wept like a man who had just been handed the bill for every sin he had ever committed. An hour crawled by, then 2. Radio silence from the surgical suite. His phone was vibrating violently in his pocket. Reporters, lawyers, board members demanding answers. He pulled it out and smashed it against the wall, shattering the screen. The only thing that there mattered in the universe was the surgical door. Finally, the hinges creaked. A surgeon in blood-spattered scrubs walked out. His face was a stone wall. Andrew shot up his legs, shaking. "How are they?" The doctor stood there in silence. It was the kind of silence that ruins lives. Andrew's throat felt like it was full of sand. "Tell me something, anything." The surgeon let out a long, heavy breath. "We managed to stabilize the infant." A tidal wave of relief crashed over Andrew, but it lasted exactly 1 second. Because the doctor wasn't smiling at all. "And Victoria?" Andrew asked, his voice cracking. The surgeon looked at the floor. "Her condition remains highly critical." Andrew's heart flatlined. "What the hell does that mean?" "She lost a massive amount of blood. The next few hours will dictate if she survives." Andrew didn't hear anything after that. Highly critical. The words bounced around his skull like shrapnel. "No, not her. You can't take her." He walked like a zombie down the hall until he reached the glass window of the ICU. He pressed his hand against the cold pane. There she was, pale as a ghost, utterly motionless, hooked up to a terrifying web of tubes and monitors. And right next to her, inside a plastic incubator, lay a tiny, fragile boy fighting for his first breaths. Andrew was staring through the glass when a raspy, familiar voice echoed from right behind him. "Now you finally understand what it feels like to be your father." Andrew spun around so fast he almost lost his balance. He froze. Standing 3 feet away was Arthur Vance. He looked like hell, pale, frail, leaning heavily on an aluminum cane, but he was very much alive. And burning in the old man's eyes was a secret he had been dragging around for over a decade. A secret that was about to detonate what was left of Andrew's reality. Andrew stared at him like he was looking at an apparition. "You're alive!" The old man let out a dry, rattling chuckle. For the moment, he shifted his weight on the cane, his face drawn tight with pain, but his gaze was like iron. "The nurses threatened to tie me to the bed, but I knew I had to get down here." Andrew ran a trembling hand through his messy hair. "They told me you had a massive heart attack. Why the hell are you out of bed?" Arthur turned his head, looking through the ICU glass at Victoria. "Because the clock has run out, Andrew." A chill crawled up Andrew's spine. "What are you talking about?" Arthur shifted his gaze to the incubator, to the tiny fingers, the closed eyes, the rapid rise and fall of the baby's chest. A soft, nostalgic smile touched the old man's lips. "He looks exactly like Michael." Andrew swallowed the lump in his throat. "You mean he looks like me?" "No," Arthur replied instantly. He snapped his mouth shut, realizing he had spoken too fast. Andrew narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Arthur looked away, staring at the fluorescent lights. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, the old man let out a ragged sigh. "There are skeletons in this family, Andrew. Things your father swore me to absolute secrecy over. Things he specifically wanted hidden from you." Andrew couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why?" Arthur looked at him with profound sadness. "Because he was terrified." "Terrified of what?" "That the truth would ruin me." A sharp, paranoid spike of adrenaline hit Andrew's system. "What truth, Arthur?" The old man leaned heavily on his cane, debating whether he had the right to shatter the boy's world. Then he spoke. "You were not Michael Sterling's only child." Andrew stared at him, uncomprehending. "I don't have any brothers." "You do." The hospital corridor seemed to tilt on its axis. "Are you telling me my father had another son?" Andrew let out a harsh, barking laugh, shaking his head. "That's insane! That's literally impossible." "It's the truth," Arthur said quietly. "If that's true, why have I never heard a whisper about him?" "Because your father made a catastrophic mistake," Arthur said, sinking slowly into a plastic waiting room chair. He looked exhausted, but the story was already spilling out. "When your father was a young man, he fell desperately in love with a woman from the wrong side of the tracks. She didn't have a dime to her name. The Sterling family went to war over it. Your grandfather threatened to cut him out of the empire entirely. So Michael caved. He did his duty, married the wealthy socialite, your mother. But a few months after the wedding, he found out his former lover had given birth to a boy." Andrew stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the words. "No." "Yes," Arthur insisted. "So what happened?" Arthur closed his eyes, the guilt of a lifetime pressing down on him. "Michael tried to play both sides. He funneled her money through shell accounts, bought them a house in the suburbs, visited them under the cover of darkness. But then there was a car crash. The boy's mother was killed instantly, and the child, he vanished into the foster system." Andrew just stared. It was too insane, too soapy. "Did they ever track him down?" "No." "Then how the hell do you even know he's still alive?" Andrew demanded. Arthur opened his eyes and locked them onto Andrew. "Because I found him." Andrew felt a ringing start in his ears. "When?" 10 years ago, the exact same week your father passed away." Andrew stepped forward, looming over the old man. "Where is he?" Arthur looked down at his hands. "He refused to meet you." "Why?" "Because he grew up believing that you were living the life that was stolen from him." The words felt like a physical punch to the gut. Andrew didn't even know this ghost, yet the resentment was palpable. "Who is he, Arthur?" The old man let out a long, shuddering breath. "He's a brilliant man, ruthless, stubborn as hell. He built his own empire from the dirt up, refusing to use the sterling name, refusing to take a dime of our money. But the hatred he holds for this family, it never burned out. A strange, creeping dread began to wrap around Andrew's throat. "You're talking about him like he's someone I know." Arthur said nothing. And then the puzzle pieces violently snapped together in Andrew's brain. The rival CEO, the apex predator who had spent the last 5 years actively sabotaging him, the guy who outbid him on contracts, poached his executives, and seemed hell-bent on burning Sterling Enterprises to the ground. Marcus Hayes. Andrew jerked his head back as if he had been slapped. "No!" Arthur didn't say a word, but his silence was a deafening confirmation. "It's him." The old man gave a slow, heavy nod. All the blood left Andrew's face. Marcus Hayes, his absolute worst enemy, the man he despised on a molecular level. They had spent years locked in a brutal corporate blood feud, destroying each other's projects, dragging each other's names through the mud in the financial press. And the entire time, they were sharing the same DNA. Andrew collapsed into the chair next to Arthur. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. A dozen hostile boardroom encounters flashed behind his eyes. Marcus had always looked at him with this bizarre, intense contempt. But sometimes, just for a fleeting second, there had been a flash of deep, unhealed agony in his eyes. Now Andrew understood exactly why. "He knows," Andrew whispered. "He's known this whole time." "Yes," Arthur confirmed, "and that's why his entire life's mission has been to dismantle me." Arthur nodded again. "He genuinely believes you squandered the legacy that rightfully belonged to him." Andrew let out a dark, hollow laugh. "That's funny." Arthur looked at him confused. "What's funny about it?" "Because I just figured it out today." Andrew turned his head, looking back through the glass at the ICU, at the machines keeping his wife breathing, at the son fighting for his life. "I finally realized that every single thing I was so damn proud of building is entirely worthless." Arthur studied him closely. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't looking at a cocky billionaire playing God. He was looking at a broken man sitting in the ashes of his own life. The old man reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a worn, yellowed envelope. The seal was still intact. "Your father left this for you." Andrew stared at the envelope like it was radioactive. "A letter?" "I was given strict instructions," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was told to hand this to you on the exact day you finally realized that money doesn't buy salvation." He offered a tragic smile. "I'd say today is that day." With shaking hands, Andrew took the envelope. Written across the front in his father's jagged script were the words, "To my son. If you are reading this, fate has granted you a final chance." Andrew forgot how to breathe. He carefully broke the wax seal, unfolded the crisp paper, and began to read. The very first sentence made his heart stop completely. "Andrew, if Victoria is still standing by your side, it means God has been far more merciful to you than I ever deserved." He jerked his head up, staring blindly at the wall. How the hell did my father know Victoria? But before he could ask, Arthur suddenly let out a strangled gasp. The old man clutched his chest, his face draining of whatever color it had left. His eyes went wide, staring at something down the hallway. "No," Arthur wheezed. "Not him! Not now!" Andrew whipped his head around. Striding down the sterile hospital corridor, moving with the lethal grace of a predator, was Marcus Hayes. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, his eyes locked onto Andrew with absolute zero temperature. His sworn enemy. And as of 5 minutes ago, his flesh and blood. But the look on Marcus's face made it violently clear that he wasn't here for a family reunion. Tucked under his arm was a thick leather dossier documents that undoubtedly held the power to vaporize whatever scraps of the Sterling Empire were left. Marcus Hayes came to a dead stop just a few feet away. The tension in the hallway was thick enough to choke on. Two titans staring each other down, separated not just by a decade of corporate warfare, but by a lifetime of stolen opportunities, lies, and unfixable damage. Andrew was the first to break the silence. His voice was ragged. "You're my brother." Marcus let out a sharp, joyless smirk. "Unfortunately." He tossed the heavy dossier onto an empty chair. "Everything in there corroborates the bedtime story Arthur just told you. It's over, Andrew." Andrew didn't even flinch. He didn't look at the folder. "Why did you come here tonight?" "To watch the empire burn," Marcus shot back, his voice dripping with venom. "To watch you lose every single thing you took for granted." But right as the words left his mouth, Marcus's eyes drifted past Andrew. He looked through the glass pane into the ICU. He saw Victoria hooked up to the ventilator, and instantly the ruthless corporate shark vanished. His face softened, shifting into something that looked dangerously close to grief. He stood there for a long time before asking, his voice barely a whisper, "Is she still fighting?" Andrew's brow furrowed in deep confusion. "You know her." Marcus slowly turned his head back. "Better than you think." Arthur let out a heavy sigh from his chair. "It's time to put all the cards on the table." Marcus looked at the floor, his jaw tightening. 5 years ago, I met Victoria at a philanthropic summit in Chicago." Andrew felt a sudden irrational spike of jealousy, but Marcus kept talking, his tone flat and honest. "I had no idea she was married to you at the time. She was running a quiet initiative for pediatric oncology, pouring her own trust fund into it, spending days in the wards, and she strictly forbade the PR teams from leaking it to the press. I was completely blown away by her. When I finally found out she was married to Andrew Sterling, the man I had spent my entire adult life trying to destroy, I felt sick." Marcus offered a bitter, self-deprecating smile. "That was the very first time I was actually jealous of you." The confession hung in the air, heavy and totally unexpected. "Jealous?" Andrew repeated, stunned. "Yeah," Marcus said, looking him dead in the eye, "because you had managed to find a woman who didn't give a damn about the zeros in your bank account. She looked at you and actually saw a human being. And you treated her like disposable garbage." Andrew looked down. He had absolutely no defense. None. Marcus took a step closer, the anger bleeding out of his voice replaced by profound disappointment. "I wanted to ruin you, Andrew. I won't deny that. I spent years engineering a corporate takeover. But when my private investigators brought me the photos of you cheating on Victoria with that social climber, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt disgusted. Because you were casually throwing away the exact thing I had been searching for my entire life." Tears burned in the corners of Andrew's eyes. He turned his head to look back at Victoria, the woman he had shattered, and the sheer crushing magnitude of his failure finally broke him. And in that exact second, a piercing, high-pitched alarm erupted from inside the ICU room. Everyone froze. The heart monitor was flatlining. A swarm of nurses and doctors sprinted down the hall, violently shoving the ICU doors open. 1 doctor, 2, 3. Andrew's face turned to ash. "No!" he screamed, slamming his hands against the glass. The lead surgeon was barking orders. A nurse was desperately pushing meds into her IV. The monitor continued its terrifying, unbroken scream. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Andrew felt his soul being ripped out of his chest. Please. He wasn't a man who prayed. He had never begged for a damn thing in his life. But right now, standing in this fluorescent hallway, he was ready to trade it all. Take the money, take the companies, take his own life. Just let her open her eyes. Marcus stood completely still, his jaw clenched in silent prayer. Arthur buried his face in his trembling hands. It felt like the universe had paused, waiting to deliver a verdict. And then, the tone of the alarm shifted. It broke into a ragged, uneven beep, then a steady rhythm. One of the nurses looked up at the surgeon and nodded. The doctor let out a massive sigh of relief, dropping his shoulders. The ICU doors swung open, and the surgeon stepped out, pulling down his surgical mask. "The crisis is over," he said quietly. "She's stabilized." Andrew couldn't breathe. She's going to live." The doctor nodded. Andrew's legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto his knees right there on the linoleum floor and sobbed. He didn't try to hide his tears. He didn't care about looking weak in front of his rival. Because sometimes a man only discovers his true strength the exact moment he allows himself to break. It took 3 grueling days for Victoria to finally wake up. When her eyelids fluttered open, the harsh hospital lights made her wince. But the very first thing coming into focus was Andrew. He wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit. He didn't have a Bluetooth earpiece in. He wasn't barking orders at an assistant. He was just a hollowed-out, exhausted man in a wrinkled shirt with dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. He had been sitting in that plastic chair by her bed for 72 hours straight. He offered a fragile, terrified smile. "Hey." Victoria stared at him for a long time, processing reality. "You're still here." He nodded slowly. "I'm not going anywhere. Ever again." She didn't say anything back, because forgiveness isn't something you can buy overnight. It has to be earned in the trenches. Months bled into seasons. Andrew voluntarily stepped down as the CEO of Sterling Enterprises. He liquidated the lion's share of his personal assets and poured the capital into the charitable foundation his father had started. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to rebuild a relationship with Marcus. It was brutal at times. They clashed, they argued, they had to learn how to be brothers from scratch. But the toxic hatred that had defined their lives began to evaporate. More importantly, Andrew showed up at Victoria's house every single day. He didn't beg her to take him back. He didn't make grand, empty speeches. He just did the work. He changed diapers. He cooked dinner. He read bedtime stories to their son. He listened, and he waited. One cool autumn evening, after little Michael had finally fallen asleep, Victoria walked out onto the back terrace. Andrew was sitting there in the dark, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. When he heard the sliding door, he instantly stood up. "Sorry, I was just leaving," he said, grabbing his coat. But Victoria surprised him. "You don't have to." He froze in his tracks. She leaned against the wooden railing, letting the silence stretch out. "You know," she said softly, "I spent a long time wondering if you can glue a shattered heart back together." Andrew looked down at his boots, the guilt rising in his throat. "And the answer is no." He flinched, bracing for the final blow. But then she smiled. A warm, quiet, genuine smile. "You can't glue the old one back together, but maybe you can grow a new one." Tears instantly sprang to Andrew's eyes. He looked up at her, barely daring to breathe. "Are you?" She nodded slowly. "I haven't forgotten the betrayal, Andrew, but I've watched the man you've become over these last few months." Andrew couldn't formulate a single word. Victoria reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him willingly in a year. "I want to try again." He closed his eyes, gripping her hand like it was a lifeline, finally understanding the absolute truth of his existence. Fortunes can be lost in a day and rebuilt in a decade. Empires can burn to the ground and rise from the ashes. Even a family shattered by ego can sometimes be dragged back from the brink of hell. But true love isn't a prize given to those who never make mistakes. It is a grace reserved for those brave enough to look at their own darkness, burn down their pride, and spend every single day proving they are worthy of a second chance. And years later, when young Michael was old enough to understand the weight of the world, someone would inevitably ask him what kind of man his father was. The boy would just smile and say, "My father was a man who had to lose the entire world just to figure out that the only wealth that actually matters is love." This deeply moving story reminds us that the true measure of a human being lies not in the size of their bank account, but in the depth of their capacity to love and change. In a world that constantly glorifies material success and power, we easily lose sight of the invisible anchors that keep our souls intact, our families, our integrity, and our shared humanity. Andre's painful journey from an arrogant billionaire to a vulnerable, repentant father illustrates that hitting rock bottom is sometimes the only way to shatter the illusion of self-importance. We often take for granted the people who love us unconditionally, assuming they will always be there, until a sudden crisis forces us to confront the terrifying reality of our own arrogance. Victoria's profound strength shows that true resilience is not about seeking loud revenge, but about silently building inner fortitude to protect the future of those we cherish. Her ability to look past betrayal and offer a second chance teaches us that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate expression of emotional maturity and grace. The unexpected brotherhood between Andre and Maxim serves as a powerful reminder that life has a beautiful, intricate way of bringing hidden truths to light when we least expect them. It urges us to stop fighting meaningless battles fueled by pride and instead focus on healing the generational wounds that divide us. Looking at this story from a personal perspective, I believe we must actively choose to evaluate our priorities before life orchestrates a crisis to do it for us. Every choice we make either builds up our human spirit or erodes it, and no amount of wealth can ever purchase a clean conscience or a genuinely peaceful home. Let us learn to speak words of gratitude today, to cherish our partners, and to listen to the wise elders who try to steer us away from our own destructive egos. True wealth is found in the simple moments in cooking a quiet dinner, reading a bedtime story to a child, and holding the hand of someone who knows our deepest flaws, yet stays. By choosing empathy over greed, we can cultivate a life that leaves a lasting legacy of love rather than a cold empire built on isolation. May this narrative inspire you to pause, reflect on your own relationships, and extend grace to someone who is genuinely trying to correct their past mistakes. Ultimately, it is never too late to strip away our armor, admit our failures, and discover that the greatest treasure in the universe is simply learning how to become human again.